The Ukrainians, I continue to be impressed with how well they have figured out not only how to stop Russia's ground operations and even push them back in certain places, but also their ability to hit Russia's oil and gas production and export capability. I mean, that to me really is path to victory for Ukraine. Is no matter what the price per barrel is, if Russia does not have oil and gas to export, then leads to the inevitable collapse of Russia's ability to fight the war.
This is the Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Global Gambit, a podcast that looks at the intersection of geopolitics, economics, international relations. And I am first thing Monday morning, or just gone Monday morning, being joined by one of my favorite people to speak to, General Ben Hodges, a regular on the show and the former commander of US Army Europe, and, well, just an expert, I think, on Ukraine, Russia, and many things, General. But one thing I want to get your immediate reaction to, no, you're not a politician, I said this before we came on, but Hungary, this is a big deal and very big excitement across Europe, very big excitement across different parts of the world. Not so much maybe in Washington. J.D. Vance seems to have not had the intended effect, or maybe he did, because everywhere he goes, it seems to do the opposite. So, but yeah, jokes aside, I'd love your initial thoughts about Hungary and what it could mean for, obviously, Ukraine, Russia, and EU decision-making.
Well, I think that the sense of relief in many places, as well as joy in many places, not only inside Hungary, but outside, to see that people can still, if people turn out to vote, they can still achieve something. And that was, for me, a very encouraging when I think about, we have our own challenges in the U.S. and in other places. The other things that are important about this, of course, is that now a much greater likelihood that the Hungarian bloc of EU funds for Ukraine would be removed with the new prime minister. I don't want to get in front of the facts, but I think that could be one of the possible outcomes of this. So not only freeing up EU funds coming to Hungary, but the large support package from the EU to Ukraine, that finally moving forward, which would be just in time. So that's a positive. And then finally, there was so much obvious Russian interference going on here. I mean, the conversations between Lavrov and the Hungarian foreign minister and with Orbán himself, the more that the bright light is shown on Russia's interference in things, this is part of their gray zone operations, a better chance to actually defeat it. So a lot of positives here.
Yeah, and in the time that we've been speaking, or since we last spoke, which was before Operation Epic Fury, or what I increasingly think is Epic Failure, obviously the US, Iran, and the implications this has had for Putin's interests in Ukraine. Very briefly, I am rather interested at the bird's eye level and the strategic level, what your thoughts have been over the past 6-7 weeks over the war with Iran and generally what it's doing to US foreign policy and military capability.
Well, I think you and I have talked before about the importance of clearly identifying the strategic outcome before you start using military force and all your other elements of national power. And I think that we didn't do that. As a professional military person myself, I'm proud of the skill that the U.S. Navy and Air Force and special operators and our intelligence community demonstrated alongside Israeli Defense Forces. I mean, there's no denying they were very good doing what the tasks they were sent to do. The problem is, no matter how many Iranian vessels are sunk or how many launchers are hit, if it doesn't achieve a strategic outcome that's good for the United States, then frankly, it's irrelevant. I mean, we did that in Vietnam and Afghanistan. We killed lots of the enemy, and we ended up losing in both of those places. And so you will have seen, and your listeners will have seen plenty of reports that here at this point, Iran still controls the strait. They still have their nuclear material. They still have the capability to launch missiles. We're not exactly sure how many they still have left. So it's kind of hard to declare a victory there. And by the way, you still have a IRGC-led regime that seems to be even more hardline than the one that was decapitated on day one. So I think that's why we are all trying to figure out what's the president going to do next, and do U.S. objectives still align with Israeli objectives?
Well, I mean, I do want to focus primarily on Russia-Ukraine, but I will come down this pathway a little bit because I think it is so pertinent to everything else. In a couple of conversations I had yesterday, I was floating the emphasis of game theory. Now, obviously, it's incredibly important in the context of military moves, decision-making, and, a lot of people will know prisoner's dilemma. But I think in this regard, about escalation levels and the willingness that either side is going to raise their escalation ladder, so to speak, this is more like a game of chicken. It seems to me that Trump does not want to back down because of his ego. And the Iranians are not going to back down because this is existential survival for them. I don't know what your thoughts would be on that. Is one more reckless than the other, or it doesn't matter in this case? Because for me, a naval blockade is not a sufficient military maneuver to force your enemy to capitulate, or I don't see how it's enforceable enough.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are scratching their heads about this idea of blockade. I mean, what is it supposed to achieve? If it's intended to deny Iran any financial resources from tolls that ships were paying or whatever, somehow increase pressure on them. But I mean, a blockade is an act of war, and it is resource intensive. It's not a couple of ships just sitting around out there in the Gulf or watching the Strait. And of course, you can imagine all the potential problems with the Chinese flagship or other ships going to. Is our Navy going to stop them? So again, this seems like an open-ended, not a gimmick thing for the Navy. The sailors doing it. This is not a gimmick at all. This is hard professional work. But I think this is why it's important that the Congress be briefed on what's going on, what's the desired end state here.
Now, we spend a lot of time talking about intelligence, surveillance, and information warfare, especially in conflicts like Ukraine. But the uncomfortable truth is that your inbox is one of the most sophisticated surveillance tools you use every day, and you probably never even questioned it. Because your email isn't just about communication, it's about your identity online. It's how you access banking, work, platforms, even government services. And most people keep that same one for over a decade, if not more. And yet, most inboxes weren't built to protect you. They were built to track you. Be that tracking pixels, hidden identifiers, or behavioral profiling. All these running quietly in the background, shaping what you see, what you click, and ultimately how you're targeted. And the strange part is that most of us never actually chose this system. We just inherited it. And that's where the real issue starts, because the next generation is inheriting it even earlier. Before they can even understand what privacy means, their digital identity is already being built, profiled, and stored. That's where Proton Mail takes a different approach. It was built in Switzerland by scientists and engineers with one idea in mind: privacy by default, not as an afterthought. With end-to-end encryption, your emails are only accessible to you, not advertisers, not big tech, not even Proton itself. There's no ads, no tracking, no profiling, just a secure inbox that you actually control. And what I find interesting about their Born Private campaign is that it flips the way we think about all of this. Because privacy isn't something you try to recover later. It's something you either start with or you slowly lose. So if you want to take back control of your digital identity, as I did, or build something much more secure from the start, you can check out Proton Mail for free using the link in the description or pinned comment. Now back to the video. Now, associated with all of this stray has obviously been NATO and the threats of withdrawal. Now, anyone who bothers to pick up a newspaper will know that you have the NDAA, or the National Defense Authorization Act of 2024. So POTUS needs 2/3 of Congress majority to actually leave NATO. So that's not happening. But what could Trump do? What is he looking to do? And well, I've got another question for you related to that.
Well, of course, every president always has the authority to move resources around, wherever they are. I mean, there's nothing in the treaty or any agreement that says the U.S. must maintain a certain troop level in Europe. I mean, when I started off as a lieutenant, there was like 300,000, mostly in West Germany. Today, and that was Army. Today, there's about 80,000 total Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, special operators total in all of Europe. So the numbers, and where they are, those are the kind of things that the president could direct. Now, there's a lot of speculation that he wants to punish Spain and a couple of other countries, perhaps by moving things from there. But I mean, that would really we call it shooting ourselves in the foot.
Self-sabotage.
Yeah, I mean, regardless of whether or not we're happy with what the Spanish are doing or the fact that they're not anywhere close to fulfilling their obligation on defense investment, the base at Rota and the base at Marón there are very important for us, for the United States, not only because of where they are proximate to the Straits of Gibraltar, but also this is part of the whole system, the logistics systems for the Navy, for our Air Force aerial fueling tankers, the ballistic missile defense system, which is based on 5 different U.S. Navy destroyers, are home ported there in Rota. So, I mean, there's a whole support structure that's there. They're not there to guard Spain. It's part of our strategic infrastructure. And so to say, okay, screw it, we're moving them. Okay, it's not like moving from one parking lot to another parking lot. I mean, it's infrastructure, this contracts is pretty significant.
Can I just, if I can jump in on this point, isn't it the most absurd thing to do? Because it's not like it's even worse than moving them out, because at least you're bringing them home and sort of replenishing your own sort of whatever stockpiles and stuff. You're literally just moving them around. I called it circle move game, musical chairs. So I'm still waking up. Clearly, I need a third coffee already today on Monday morning. But no, it's a game of musical chairs. You're literally just moving them from one place to another. It doesn't change anything. The security architecture and aggregate is still the same. And if anything, if he moves them from Spain to Eastern Europe, because the idea is you want to punish the less supportive European nations and support the more, Poland and the others, well, that's only going to work in Europe's favor because it bolsters NATO's eastern flank against Moscow. Or am I missing something?
Well, the thing that's not so obvious is the infrastructure, the support that's there already in existence in Rota, for example. I mean, you have longstanding contracts for maintenance, for training, the people that support these ships. I mean, it's not just a parking area for ships. It's a significant part of the infrastructure. And so if you want to relocate that to punish the Spanish, it's going to be several months at best, reestablishing capabilities elsewhere. And, a big part of our successful deterrence over the decades was this trust. And in this case, while I think some European countries could have been a little bit more clever on how they responded here, the fact is this is a war of choice by the United States, and you can't start one of those and then just assume all your allies will follow you into it. And that's where we are. And of course, we could have been smarter in understanding that Prime Minister Sanchez is he has saved himself politically. I mean, for domestically inside Spain, he was in pretty bad shape. Now, this has really ratcheted up his favorability there in Spain. And we, okay, well, screw you, we're moving our base. That will just make him even more raise his profile. So what I hope is that the military leadership from the Supreme Allied Commander, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and others, and the relevant congressional defense oversight committees will say, hey, hold on. Let's think about what's best for the United States. Where do we need to have things? And maybe moving out of Spain, as an example, or out of Italy or any of these places might not be the best thing for us.
You're much more measured than I thought you were going to be, if I'm honest, General. I thought you'd be a bit more amused by the moronicness of these decisions or sort of suggested ideas to do.
Well, at this point, it does nothing to just keep saying how moronic it is, which I have said, but try to explain, because I get plenty of unfriendly comments, on Twitter and things about this, but they're typically from people who don't understand why do we have something in Spain? They're not there to guard the Spaniards from the Moroccans or whatever. It's for our benefit. And so that's what I'm trying to do. You have a good platform, and you're giving me a chance to try and explain to serious people, why it matters, why we're there, why we don't want to be too quick to ditch it.
Well, the irony is that in recent days, I've actually started a new series of quick takes where I'm a bit more unhinged, perhaps like Trump was a couple of weeks ago, where I've tried to, apply rationale and strategical thinking to Trump, and now I'm just like, no, he's just, yeah. So
Yeah.
I've gone completely off the cliff of reasonableness. But
All right. Well,
you're bringing me
I'll
back.
be worried when I see you sending out tweets at 3 a.m. with you as Jesus in some picture or something like that. I hope you're not going that way.
Okay, hang on. Let me just close my ChatGPT tab. I was making it. So moving on then. What about therefore the implications for these strategic shifts? Let's just sort of blanket them together for Moscow. How do you think Putin's feeling right now? Because he's been benefiting from a lot of windfalls, making $150 a day, but things are still not exactly going on very easily for Russians on the battlefield. So I'm kind of interested for your broader take, and then we'll dive into some specifics.
Okay, so obviously with Orbán's defeat, that's a huge blow for the Russians. All right, so they're losing their main guy who was able to interfere with inside the EU or NATO when it comes to Ukraine. So that's going to be a setback. The second thing is and you're right, from a positive side, is the price of oil going up. He's benefiting from this, no doubt. And the one person on the planet that President Trump never criticizes is Vladimir Putin. And so he can continue to enjoy not having to worry about pressure from the United States, and he doesn't seem to be too concerned about pressure from European countries so far. But the Ukrainians, I continue to be impressed with how well they have figured out not only how to stop Russia's ground operations and even push them back in certain places, but also their ability to hit Russia's oil and gas production and export capability. I mean, that to me really is path to victory for Ukraine. Is no matter what the price per barrel is, if Russia does not have oil and gas to export, then this leads to the inevitable collapse of Russia's ability to fight the war. Now, when does that happen? Not this year, I don't think. But what would really be helpful would be big investments by European countries into Ukraine's defense to help them produce to scale this long-range precision strike capability they've developed.
Interesting. I made a video back in February, about 2 weeks before the whole things with Iran took off fully, and it was essentially about the cannibalism of Russia's economy, that Putin's decisions and choices were not just making the Russian economy not grow, but actually eat itself from the inside out. And this, the war in Iran seems to have given him a little bit of, as I said, a little bit of breathing space, but not enough. And that's because, again, there was a remarkable article I read in Al Jazeera, and it was just giving a depiction of the numbers of casualties that the Russians are sustaining, which I think are the highest at any point now in the 4.5 years of the full-scale war. How accurate do you think those numbers are? And how much do you think it is due to the Ukrainians' usage of drones and their industrial capacity?
I would say the vast majority of it is due to how Ukraine has figured out ways to create this sort of zone where it's almost impossible for individual Russians to move across the battlefield. Now, that works both ways, but it does seem that they have managed to achieve a level of attrition that is greater than Russia's current ability to intake new soldiers and train them and prepare them. So when we first heard the new defense minister a few months ago saying that his goal was 50,000 per month, I thought, okay, well, that seemed like a lot. And also why? Now it makes sense to me that they've done the analysis on how much can Russia actually bring in, even if they go to a full mobilization of some sort. If you're taking 50,000 Russian troops off the table every month, I mean that will be very, very difficult for Russia to sustain that. Even though they don't care about what happens to their troops or their people, just mathematically that would be difficult. So we'll see. I'm always slightly skeptical of numbers, but I don't see any people from different countries out there saying, "Oh, these are all bullshit. These are obviously inflated." I think British intelligence and others are the ones that are the source that provide most of this.
Well, yeah, I wanted to ask you bluntly on that. Obviously, both sides have to inflate figures, I think. Let's be realistic for morale, for informational warfare. But, do you think that the British intelligence accuracy is the highest? Because, frankly, the state of the UK in its other military capabilities, i.e. HMS Dragon, and inability to get down to Cyprus is rather embarrassing. So you still think that they're dependable numbers?
I don't think I would conflate British intelligence, and accuracy of their reporting with whether or not the Royal Navy has maintenance issues.
Fair enough. I'm just I'm being slightly critical because as a Brit, I want it to be Britain to be capable, but it's a concern. I will be honest.
Well, look, hey, there's no denying it that the UK is not at the level of capabilities that it was, but that's a result of decisions by multiple governments, which is typically the case with all of us. Our military here in Germany, where I live, or the U.S. or anybody else, decisions on whether or not to invest in the future, invest in people, investing in infrastructure, invest in training, logistics, all that. The real effect is typically felt down the road several years. And so I think this is where we are. There's no denying it that while the quality of people in the Royal Navy and Air Force and the British Army are as good as I've ever seen, it's the quantity and the capabilities is not what is needed for the UK. But these are decisions that governments have to make and explain to their people.
Fair enough. All right. So when we look at the war more specifically on the battlefront, the Ukrainians have been increasingly targeting Russian infrastructure behind the front lines, really trying to undermine supply chains, communication links, and so on. How much do you think that could be a decisive factor in the next couple of months as we enter the summer, and that's when critical shifts can occur?
Well, I think it's hard for me to know for sure the specific what percentage of capability is really damaged. How fast are the Russians able to repair some of this stuff? I mean, you can hit a refinery once really hard, but you got to revisit it occasionally to make sure that they're not able to get it back online. My sense is that they are probably somewhere between 40 and 50% of Russia's oil and gas export capability has been either destroyed or severely damaged. I mean, that's a lot. And if European nations, including UK, get serious about these shadow fleet vessels and stopping them, this will cause a real problem for the Russians. The attack on rail infrastructure is really important. When you look at the distances and and moving things like ammunition for the Russian army, I mean those are the kind of targets that you want to hit that can have an impact on the battlefield. So I've made the mistake in the past of predicting when something might be done by. I'm less willing to put a time on things these days, but it feels like the whole war is I'm trying to avoid the use of something like tipping point, because you don't really know there's a tipping point until you're well past it and you look back and go, aha, that's when it happened. But it feels like the momentum has shifted in a way that I think is permanent in favor of Ukraine.
Well, can we unpack that a little bit further? When you say shifted, does that mean that they're going to start making notable gains on the ground, or it's just about their capacity to produce drones consistently, independent of external support? Is it about the numbers, the funding? What aspects do you think are contributing to this?
Okay, good. So for sure, one of them is that you just don't hear people talking in different fora, and whether it's leaders or private people, this notion that somehow Russian victory is inevitable. I mean, that's not out there. You remember it was a little over a year ago that President Trump and Vice President Vance were yelling at President Zelensky in the Oval Office. One terrible scene there. That's unimaginable that they would be doing that now, because it's clear that not only does President Zelensky have cards, he's even helping the Saudis and others defend themselves against Iranian drones. So he's exporting security to the Gulf, even after President Trump said, we don't need Ukraine's help. But clearly, they do need Ukraine's help. So that tells you about the capacity and the capabilities that Ukrainians have. The fact that the likelihood of Russia launching, I mean, there was supposed to be yet again another big famous spring offensive. You know, the most talked about, seldom seen fact of the war is these Russian spring offensives that never actually amount to anything except a lot of casualties. The one thing that I can't figure out yet is how do we finally stop Russia's incessant air and missile attacks against civilian population. I mean, that's still going on, and they have in some cases increased the numbers of what they're launching, which makes it difficult to knock them all down, no matter how good the Ukrainians are. So I think we're going to see continued Ukrainian civilian casualties as a constant in the war, unfortunately. But you just don't hear about the problems about, oh, there's not enough artillery ammunition, they don't have enough troops. You just don't hear about that anymore. What you hear about is enormous Russian casualties and Russian refineries on fire. That's what you hear about the most.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you, and what some people I see in the comments are interested to know is, what would you be recommending the Ukrainian armed forces to be doing? Striking more oil targets, targeting such infrastructure like that to create as much internal chaos for Russia, just continue what they're doing, the oil wells of Russia, so to speak?
I think that they are on the right path by going after the center of gravity of Russia's ability to sustain this war is its oil and gas export capability. And so if you can eliminate that, then I think that has obviously such a major effect on everything else. The ability to recruit, train, and field more troops, to run their own defense industry, some sort of economy for Russian people. I think that their economy is propped up artificially, and it's not a sustainable model. And Ukrainians can see that better than anybody. So I would encourage them. They don't need my encouragement. I think that's what they've decided to do. The thing that needs help is more of the capability that they have developed, the long-range precision weapons that manage to get through Russian air defenses and then blow apart the critical component of a refinery, having more of those. And then I think, we're going to continue to see in places local tactical successes as well. But it looks to me like they're being pretty clever on how and when they choose to do that.
So for much of 25, I think we'd focused on the strategic level, what was happening in the White House, between the US and EU. And of course, that's still always going to be relevant. But do you think in 26, it's going to be more of a case of the tactical defining the strategic, what the Ukrainians are able to do upwards, if you know what I mean, because they're making so many military gains or impacts that influences the decision-making in Brussels vis-a-vis funding to Ukraine, relations with Putin and Trump, etc.?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think it's either or. I would imagine that at some point, the Russians began to think about, if my assessment is correct about the shift in momentum, do the Russians start thinking that they need to come to some sort of settlement before they lose too much of what they have taken? I mean, is the pressure on the Russian side now? And of course, we certainly don't know. I certainly don't know what's happening inside of Russia. What kind of pressure is Vladimir Putin under? The fact that he asked oligarchs to make contributions to the war effort, I mean, that to me was a pretty interesting insight into the state of things there. If he's having to ask all the rich guys to make a contribution to the war effort. So I think there's things, I wish I knew much better what's happening inside Russia. The people who can read the language that I listen to talk about the Russian male bloggers, how critical they are of the Russian war effort. They have a sort of there's a collective reputation for them being pretty candid. And right now it seems that they're pretty bearish on Russia's situation. The Ukrainians can see that, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I can say limited about that because I don't speak Russian, unfortunately, but I have a lot of friends there, and it's yeah, people are pretty pissed. Aside from the traditional alcoholic version of pissed, they're pretty emotionally pissed off as well. I guess my final question for you, or penultimate question, is what if Trump really tries to pull a fast one on NATO? What if we see a really, really unfortunate position over transatlantic relations? Could that embolden Putin in some way, or he doesn't have the bandwidth because of what we're seeing right now?
Well, as you alluded to earlier, I don't think that the United States, the president can unilaterally pull out. And I think while there are some members of the Congress that complain about NATO and say we should get out, most of the serious, knowledgeable people understand this. It's in our benefit to continue to be in NATO. And so while the actual profile of what's there may change, I just don't see that changing in terms of U.S. remaining a part of the alliance. It's our benefit. But the secret sauce for NATO has always been the cohesion. The fact that no matter what was going on politically, there was never a doubt that the U.S., the UK, Canada, Germany, everybody would always show up to defend another member of the alliance if there ever was an attack. And the more that President Trump says what he says, it begins to erode that, or it continues to erode that cohesion. And that could lead to the Russians making a terrible miscalculation about whether or not the alliance was still really willing to fight. And then in less obvious, but this lack of trust also will cause some countries to begin to be a little bit less willing to share intelligence. And I think understandably so. And that's definitely not good for any of us if you don't have this good intelligence sharing. 50% of what the U.S. government uses does not come from American satellites. It comes from allies in terms of intelligence. That's the kind of thing, that's the narrative that Putin wants to feed, is to keep eroding the confidence between all of us. Their gray zone operations are going to continue. And as long as they see that we're not able or willing to actually really inflict punishment on them for what they do, then I think that will continue.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I'm very bullish on Europe, partially because I want to be, but also because I just think people are overly pessimistic. I think there's a lot of potential here. NATO without the United States, or NATO minus, is still $400 billion worth of military expenditure. That's more than China and Russia combined. And that's not without putting a lot of European economies in a wartime footing, like Russia is at max capacity, let's be honest. So I think that there's a lot here. Now Hungary's back in, and I'm just seeing in a headline here that the UK could adopt an EU single markets rule. So the UK is really beginning to, one of the few things the government is doing right, pivot more towards Europe and less from the US, as much as I don't like to say that. But, in your opinion, these are the things I'm watching. What would you encourage people to watch in the time that we next speak, in a month or however long it is?
Well, the president has an important meeting with President Xi coming up in just a few weeks. And I think both the U.S. and China are probably anxious to avoid a big high-profile blow of some sort ahead of that. So that's one thing to see how they move towards each other. This interesting thing by the Royal Navy and the Norwegians calling out these 3 Russian submarines the other day. That was a big deal. Not only the fact, nobody should have been surprised, I think, that the Russians would have submarines lurking around looking at pipelines and cables. But to publicly call them out. The norm for naval services in the whole anti-submarine warfare sort of aspect of things is you keep an eye on them, but you don't want them to know that you know exactly where they are. And that's the whole game, is to be able to track where they are so that should a crisis begin, you know exactly where their attack subs are or their nuclear weapons subs are. So here, the decision to go ahead and publicly announce, we know where you three knuckleheads are, and we're not going to tolerate this. And of course, they all left. That was a demonstration of capability. I'm glad UK did that. And frankly, working with the Norwegians is a good way to address that part of the Atlantic anyway.
Yeah, the GI-UK gap and Norway by extension, I think a lot there to think about, and definitely I'll be covering it as well in future videos. But General Ben Hodges, former US Army Commander of Europe, thank you so much as always for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure, everyone watching. Do be sure to follow the General's work if you haven't already. Do like and subscribe the video if you haven't already. Of course, it's very important and it's free. But we'll be back in the coming days with some exciting guests. General Wesley Clark is going to be on the show, and a few other big guests as well. So I'm looking forward to that. We'll see you all next time. Take care.
Thanks, Peter.